Story of us. I hope you all had nice second night Seders last week, which is why we didn't have class then, of course. In the week before, we had done a special on Passover, where we'd really looked at the story of Pesach through a story of us lens. So today we are going to return back to the long journey through Jewish history that we have been making. So I want to situate ourselves in history again before we look at some text. We're hopefully going to spend a good chunk of today dealing with actual texts. We're going to look at the Talmud. But I want to offer an alternative version of some of these historical events as well. I've done a whole bunch of reading over the last few weeks. So one of the themes I think you've gotten from me since we got to the Roman period and beyond in the story of us, meaning from about the year 0 and beyond, is that the rabbis and the rabbinic movement were much fringier and less powerful than we give them credit for today. Is that sort of a blanket statement? Does that feel fair for what I've said? So upon going and doing some significant reading and looking at various sources, I think it's fair to say that they are even fringier and less powerful than the version that I have presented the rabbis to be. So I want to talk a little bit about why it is that we have this illusion. A lot of this goes to a scholar, Jacob Neusner, who sort of revolutionized Talmudic studies. Many folks may have heard of his name. He became relatively well known in this world. So what happens is the Talmud becomes the central document of Jewish civilization and Jewish life. Certainly by the time we are talking the 1500s, I'm just making up a date right now, unquestionably the Talmud is at the center of Judaism. It is the most important document of Jewish religiosity, Jewish civilization, Jewish culture. I think it's fair to say today as well, the Jews are not the people of the Bible. We are the people of the Talmud. Or maybe even better, the Judaism is not the religion of the Bible. Judaism is the religion of the Talmud. Yeah, I like that second way I said it better than the first way. So one of the things that the Talmud does, written over hundreds and hundreds of years, we've compared it to Wikipedia, is that the Talmud tells the stories of their earliest rabbinic ancestors. So all the stories that we have about the early rabbis, the story we had about Rabbi Yochanan sneaking out of a besieged Rome in a coffin, right? We looked at that story together. All of these stories are redacted, told, written, edited, whatever words you want to put to it, by rabbis living sometimes 700 or 800 years later. Embellished, yeah. But what's happening is, as we all do, they're taking their own cultural context and their cultural moment and projecting it backwards. They're taking their own image of a rabbinic-based Judaism and imagining that their early rabbis, who they're holding up as these heroes, aren't just similarly powerful to them, but in fact, since they look at them with such reverence, the whole world must have looked at them with such reverence back then. And so they create this legend and this lore of powerful rabbis back in the day that is totally ahistorical. So I was going through, I found a list of the names of the rabbis by generation in the Mishnah. So the Mishnah, the preeminent Jewish document of rabbinic Judaism, published around the year 200 CE, sent off to Babylon, becomes the core of the Talmud. There's like 250 human beings who are listed in the Mishnah. It's fair to say that at any given time after the destruction of the temple, that there are a couple dozen rabbis at any given time, period. Like a couple dozen rabbis, that the whole world after the destruction of the temple in 70, and again, we could be talking 100, 130, 200, whenever we're talking in this period, that there were probably about as many rabbis in St. Louis as there were in existence.
Are you talking 200 Common Era?
Common Era. All of this is on our side of zero. Exactly. So the rabbis, and this is where Jacob Neusner really sort of has changed my thinking a little bit. The way I have presented the rabbis, I think, is as a continuation of the Pharisees. If we go by Josephus's estimates, we probably have a few thousand Pharisees. Again, this is before the destruction. It seems that maybe rather than thinking of the rabbis as the unbroken continuation of the Pharisaical movement, they are instead a group of fringy people picking up the traditions and remnants of a largely destroyed movement and society and creating something new with it. But the rabbis in the early Roman period are almost certainly not politically powerful. The Sanhedrin seems to have not existed in any meaningful sense after the destruction, and prior to the destruction would not have been stocked with rabbis, but with elites. And the rabbis were certainly not elites. So as a driven leaf, the way that it presents the Sanhedrin and the importance of the rabbis is wildly ahistorical. But it's not ahistorical because they were intentionally being ahistorical, but instead the scholarship around this is really pretty recent. So we also see a divide in the scholarship, and this will bring us to the story of us in our moment today. The scholarship is really divided about the political power of the early rabbis by geography. By and large, the Talmud has scholars in Israel and in America. There's some people in other places, some places in Europe, etc. But by and large, Talmudic scholarship exists in Israel and America. And Zionist scholarship and Zionists, Miriam, I see your hand. Let me say this first. Again, I know we're all used to hearing the Z word as sort of a pejorative these days. That's not how I'm meaning it here. But Zionist scholarship around the Talmud was really invested, or Zionist scholarship in general, was invested in a version of Jewish history that provided antecedents to the current Jewish state. So in particular, it presented an image of the early rabbis as effectively running a somewhat independent vassal state in Israel, controlled by the Romans, but being sort of the government of the Romans in Israel until at least the rise of Christianity in the empire. Does it make sense why a Zionist perspective on history would want to present it that way? It turns out that's almost certainly not true, that the rabbis continue to be very fringy. One of the other pieces that really stood out to me in Neusner scholarship is the ways that the synagogue was not the home of the rabbis or rabbinic Judaism. The synagogue movement appears to be independent of the rabbis, with sometimes the rabbis associating and affiliating and being involved in certain synagogues, and sometimes not. But a synagogue was not the home for rabbis. Rabbis instead ran the Beit Midrash, the study house. Now, even just look at the language. They ran a study house, not an enormous university, not enormous places that you would go and study, but instead we're talking about a movement composed of, again, sometimes just a dozen or two individuals spread throughout mostly the north of Israel, who would have disciples who would meet in their homes to study, but no larger official organizations. And in fact, if your rabbi that you were studying with, that you were a disciple of, died, you had to go find a place at another rabbi's home. And so the fact that we're talking the homes of these people should also give us a sense of the scale. This is tiny. This is fringy. This is not mainstream at all. We're going to look at a rabbinic text from the Talmud today that talks about how all of the sages gathered in the upper floor or the upper room of a house in Lod, where the airport is now. Well, if all of the sages can gather in the upper story room, we're talking about a pretty small group of people. Miriam. Yes. First of all, Jewish populations were a little wider than that. Certainly, we have significant populations throughout the Roman Empire, including in Roman Europe. Jews we know are in Germany by this time period, or what would become of Germany. But again, they're following along with, by and large, the Romans. And similarly, Jews are spread throughout the neo-Persian Empire as well, though collected in and around Baghdad. That seems clear. But more to your point, Miriam, it's not clear is the answer. What these synagogues were. They certainly appear to be places of gathering for prayer, whatever prayer looks like at this time. They also are places where you gather to hear the sacred scrolls read. Maybe the best example of we have of that are from the Gospels in the Christian Bible, where people show up in the synagogues. And sometimes there's rabbis there, sometimes there's not. It may be that the synagogues were a product of the Pharisees. And again, the Pharisees appear to be significantly more disconnected from the post-destruction rabbis than I think I previously understood them to be. So, for instance, Jesus shows up in a synagogue and reads the book of Isaiah. He's chanting the Haftorah. Probably the Torah is being read in synagogues, is my guess. We probably have a weekly Torah portion, a parsha, that has been largely divided up, that is read in the synagogues at this point. Those appear to be the focus. Community spaces, gathering spaces, but not the home of the rabbis and not the domain of the rabbis, even as some rabbis were involved in synagogues. Paul. Generally, it appears that the synagogues were probably public and known. Some of them are highly decorated. We have some of the earliest synagogues in the same areas where the rabbis are hanging out, Caesarea and places like this, Tzipori, are the ones where we find the tile mosaic zodiacs that ours is based on. So those are contemporaneous that we're talking about here. So no, it actually seems like the synagogue in many ways was not generally terribly political, maybe. Okay, so that's the Jewish environment of the rabbis living in the Levant, living in Judea, Israel, Palestine, whatever name we're calling it based on the time period. The Jews living in the neo-Persian Empire, we know even less. There is a stunning absence of history of the neo-Persian Empire in general. And because we don't even have a broad history to understand this empire, we also don't have much of a history of the small Jewish minority outside of the Talmud's tellings of it. So there are some who believe that rabbis were more prominent in the Babylonian experience. There are some who believe that the rabbis were significantly less prominent in the Babylonian Jewish environment. What we do know is that through the 500s, 400s, 500s in Babylon and Mesopotamia and Iran and Iraq, that by and large, these Talmudic academies should not be understood as academies, but houses and homes, that they're much smaller, much less organized, much less official, much less politically important than even the version that I presented a couple weeks ago. By the time you get to about 100 years of Islam, so into the 500s, you start seeing the development of real institutions where there's been a critical mass of not just rabbinic following Jews, but of rabbis, that institutions can be started, and that something that might be like a yeshiva that we would recognize, a yeshiva being a rabbinical training school, begins to emerge. Now, one of the reasons this is really difficult, by the way, is the Mishnah itself, written in 200, talks about yeshivas, yeshivot. But if anyone knows any Hebrew, yeshiva is just the word for yeshav, or a place of sitting, not even dwelling, sitting. So when we think of yeshivas today, we think of rabbinical schools. And later, folks who are even writing the Talmud late in the Talmudic period have a model of something like rabbinical schools that's a yeshiva. But almost certainly the early yeshivas are not institutions, but are a literal circle of a handful of people sitting on the ground and studying together, where maybe the only one sitting is the rabbi. So if you're familiar with Pirkei Avot, you know there's a line that says, "Sit in the dust at the feet of a rabbi." Mm. It's quite possible that we're not talking metaphorical here, that this is really what it worked. Like that if you were a part of the rabbinic movement, you were following in elite rabbinic, an elite religious minority that had marginal political power at best. And the rabbis that do end up with political power don't seem to have it because they are rabbis, but because they are otherwise connected. And that it's actually those situations that lead to rabbis becoming a politically important movement.
Is there at any time in here a point at which someone, a person of learning, is considered a rabbi? What is the cutoff? What is the...
Yeah, so a rabbi at this point is being ordained by someone who is already an ordained rabbi.
Okay. Like it is today.
Yes, though there is actually a break in history. Right?
Okay.
But that's what it is. So you have madrasas, exactly, Miriam. So you have people who are incredibly important, significant figures in the Talmud who are never ordained. You also have situations where you are studying under Rav Papa. You're a disciple of Rav Papa. He's getting ready to ordain you, and Rav Papa dies. And there's no institutions, there's no rabbinical schools, there's none of these. So all of a sudden you go looking for somewhere else, and there's a back bench available over at Rav Huna's place. But that's how you end up not becoming a rabbi.
Gotta work your way back to the front of the line.
Yeah. And to be a rabbi, at that time probably would have meant that one of these fringy people doing house church has picked you and said, you can go start your own house church. Church, I know, but maybe gives you an image there. Okay, other thoughts or questions on this?
As a driven leaf, they make you think there's a body of knowledge that they're trained in, even though you go live in somebody's room and study with them.
Yes. As a driven leaf is a 1940s, 1939 myth based on 8th century rabbinic myths about 1st century rabbis who would have looked very little like the 700-year late. Right, exactly. And it's a great book. I mean, I love the book, and it's a great introduction to Judaism today in some ways, but into how we look at rabbis
It's
and the rabbinic
also-
movement
It's
today.
also a great connection to the thing that we looked at about,
And before we go to
Well,
Pardes and the
yes.
text, yeah, exactly. Other questions? Miriam, I see you're unmuted. So there are gatherings that happen, the kalas. Some say on a yearly basis, semi-annual. There's all sorts of different models for what that may have looked like. But yeah, no, we've got great examples of this. In fact, there's stories in the Talmud of exactly what we're talking about, where you're a disciple of Rav Papa. Rav Papa dies. You go end up in Rav Huna's circle, and Rav Huna's teaching things really differently than Rav Papa's understandings. And we have these stories of students who've lost their rabbi going to another rabbi and sitting in the back sort of snickering and laughing about how different they understand it here. So
it's not very different.
So it's the teachings of these very early rabbis that end up being anthologized into the Mishnah in the year 200. And then with all of their various views in there, including their disagreements. And then we see the process that happens for about 300 years in the north of Israel that results in what's known as the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, or the Palestinian Talmud, or even though it's not written in Jerusalem and Palestinian has become a political word and all these things. So there's no good way of talking about it. But anyways, the Talmud Yerushalmi, that's the first Talmud. But the Talmud in Babylon goes on for about 200 years longer than that because there's less political disruption to the community there. And so we see those differences as well. And the Talmud Bavli is much more expansive to the point where when we talk about the Talmud today, it's always the Babylonian Talmud.
What is the difference between the Mishnah and the Talmud and how they were put together?
So did folks hear what Suzanne said? What's the difference between the Mishnah and the Talmud and how they're put together? So the Mishnah is written and compiled by about the year 200 or so.
Mm-hmm.
The Gemara is the process that's happening in these study houses in Babylon and in the north of Israel. That is a commentary in the broadest of senses, commentary and expansion on the Mishnah. But it's an expansion that's, 20 times longer than the source document. The Mishnah is redacted and edited in a relatively short time period. The Talmud is like Wikipedia. It goes through 600, 700 years of authorship and then editing. And we have about 200 years, the last 200 years of the Talmud is just editing, and that the rabbis of the Talmud during this period, their names don't get listed. In fact, they're known as the stamim, the anonymous ones. But they're the ones who rewrite the stories of the early rabbis to make sense to them in their current political context. They don't think they're lying. They're just telling history as they understand it. Yeah, we all do this, right? Mm-hmm. Moses came down from Mount Sinai wearing a strimal and wrapping tefillin. That's right. That's what happens. Okay, other questions before we jump into some text? So we're going to look at a text from the Talmud. We're going to look at a rather famous story from the Talmud. Some of us have studied this together before, but I wanted something a little juicy as long as we were going to do this. And I want us to really try to peer between the lines, to not take it at its surface level, but to think about what is it that the people who are writing this were trying to say and accomplish to their peers at that moment. Okay, any other thoughts or questions before we jump in? Okay, let me show self view and spotlight this for everyone so everyone can see it. Is this coming through okay? Yeah. Make sure I've got this on high def. I do. Okay. Anyone Anyone want to read for us? Let me see. I can make it a little bigger. Maybe that'll help. How's that? Okay, is there someone maybe on Zoom who'd like to read for us, or someone here? It doesn't matter.
Okay, apropos the topic of verbal mistreatment.
So that's a note just from this edition of the Talmud. By the way, anything that's not in bold is added in by the editors here, sometimes from traditional commentaries and sometimes just to make sense of it. The Talmud is indecipherable without the modern translations or intense.
So read them all, keep them all.
So keep them all, but yeah, in that little symbol, the double S just tells us we're dealing with a new section here that doesn't exist within the Talmud. It's, again, our editors helping us understand that we're entering into a little pericope.
We have to help you make sense of this. Okay. We learned in a Mishnah there.
So they're referencing, that's like saying Ibid. It's the previous reference.
If one cut an earthenware oven widthwise into segments and placed sand between each and every segment, Rabbi Eliezer deems it ritually pure.
So they're not talking about kashrut. They're talking about ritual purity, which is a little different. But for our perspective, think of it as kashrut. And there's a general idea that says that a earthenware vessel, we're talking about a oven, a tanur, by the way, is the word in Aramaic, which is clearly the exact same word as tandoor, an Indian oven that's made the same way, that a tanur can become ritually impure. It can catch cooties.
Juices or something.
Yeah. But a broken vessel cannot become ritually impure. So we're really caring about humans. If you touch an impure oven, you can contract impurity. But if you touch broken pieces of, you can't contract impurity. So Rabbi Eliezer comes up with this great idea. He says, I'm going to take an oven, I'm going to break it on purpose, I'm going to put sand in between the pieces, and now we have an oven that can't become ritually impure. It's a technological innovation.
Because of the sand, its legal status is not that of a complete vessel, and therefore it is not susceptible to ritual impurity, or ritual sin. And the rabbis deem it ritually impure as it is functionally a complete oven.
Okay, so Rabbi Eliezer says this is how it is, that you can do it this way, and the rabbis, meaning everyone else, disagrees with him. So that's the setup here. And this is known as the oven of Achnai. This story becomes famous. The Gemara asks, what is the relevance of Achnai, a snake, in this context? Achnai means snake. Rav Yehuda has a tradition from Shmuel that says that the rabbis surrounded it with their statements like a snake, which coils around something and deems it ritually impure. So I just want to note there, can you feel the editor at work? Do you see the editor who just jumped in and said, you know, this story, which we call the Oven of Achnai, let me tell you a tradition as to where this title comes from. So this is an editorial break that we see, and we want to work to see these seams in the Talmud as we are reading it. And then we get the traditional beginning to a teaching. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught. Harriet, if you're up for it.
Oh, sure. The sages taught on that day. When they discussed this matter, Rabbi Eliezer answered all possible answers in the world to support his opinion, but the rabbis did not accept his explanations from them.
Okay, so Rabbi Eliezer makes the logical case, and any objection that anyone has, Rabbi Eliezer is able to explain how they're wrong. They can refute them, but they don't care, and they still don't agree with him.
After failing to convince the rabbis logically, Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, this carob tree will prove it. The carob tree was uprooted from its place 100 cubits, and some say 400 cubits.
I love that they're not questioning whether or not carob trees can get up and dance, just how far they can dance.
The rabbi said to him, one does not cite halachic proof from the carob tree. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, the stream will prove it. The water in the stream turned backward and began flowing in the opposite direction. They said to him, one does not cite halakhic proof from the stream.
Okay, so what are we learning about the nature of the early rabbis from this text so far? Anyone have thoughts? Any Zoomers have thoughts?
It's not very different.
Okay,
Well, this is crazy.
okay.
Kind
It
of
also
read it.
isn't, it also isn't very different from having 3 Jewish people in a room together now.
Okay, the disagreement, yeah, certainly.
Yeah, but you can look at a stream supposedly turning and going in the other direction, and that's not enough to prove your point. That's you got to really go some to
Yeah,
prove it.
okay.
You kind of question Rabbi Eliezer's authority in this group.
Okay, yeah, certainly. Toby?
Mm.
Exactly. Exactly. So part of this is later rabbis imagining the early rabbis as miracle workers, right? But I also want to suggest that this sort of magicianship, maybe that's what it is. Look at the Christian scriptures and the stories that are told about Jesus and his miracles. They're not that different than the sorts of miracles that are showing up so far in this story. We are talking about charismatic, public prophets. Again, not prophets like biblical prophets like we've talked about them in their historical context, but how we understand prophets like Elisha, or these are public fringy magicians who are traveling around. This is very different from the rabbis of a yeshiva, hunched over and their nose in the Gemara. And okay, let's keep going. Oh, Elliot's saying to speak a little bit slower. I can absolutely speak a little slower. I can also get a different microphone next time if that's helpful for people. I can even start. I can just bring this a little closer to me. That should make a difference too.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. The later rabbis aren't miracle workers. Only the early rabbis. Yeah. Okay, let's keep going. Let's keep going with this story. Someone else want to read? Or Harry, do you want to keep going? Or
No, I'll pass it on.
Not me, I can't.
please. Eliezer. This is the great leaning tower of Lod. So we missed, I think, the beginning. I didn't go back quite far enough where it says that all this is happening in the upper chamber of a house in Lod.
Okay.
And this, I think it was Miriam, were you the one who asked earlier about all the disagreements and how they resolved them and how different each of these? I think we have an image of that here. This is a gathering of the rabbis who come together to resolve disputes, figure out how they're going to understand this stuff, and then spread back out after their gatherings, after their convention. And they all fit in the upper chamber, right? Think about just
Any
architecture. Think about architecture for a second in the ancient classical world. You can't have that big of a room on a second floor. So, right, we're not talking about stone palaces here. So we're really talking a small, fringy group of people who are sort of going around and miracle workers, and you can imagine them going back to their villages. And
Who is supporting them?
who's supporting them is a good question. Some of these people are independently wealthy. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Judah the Prince, who's traditionally understood as the editor of the Mishnah, is probably paying for a lot of this. He appears to be politically connected and a rabbi, and so his political connections help the rabbinic movement, not the other way around. But there's some of these people, there's a real divide, there's a real class divide amongst the rabbis, where some of them are quite wealthy and some of them are quite poor. There's a story, actually Karen talked about it in a High Holy Day sermon back at the J, so that was forever ago. But there's a story about, maybe it's Rabbi Eliezer, maybe it's Rabbi Gamliel, who's wealthy and shows up at Rabbi Joshua's house and discovers that the whole place is covered in soot because he's a blacksmith, and looks back at Rabbi Joshua and says, what kind of life is this for a rabbi? You schlepper doing this? And Rabbi Joshua sort of gives him a look like, well, turns out not all of us are wealthy people who can dally around all day.
Their wives were working.
Yeah. No, that's
Sometimes their wives are working,
Day.
but probably not during this time period. That's not, yeah. Okay, let's keep going.
Or they were waiting for it to come home to dust.
Keep reading, please. By the way, is this easier to hear me? I changed microphones.
Yes,
No,
not.
no.
Maybe. Great. Okay, whoever was reading, if you keep going. Thanks, Toby. Jewish law. Actually, hold on, Miriam, let me revise that. Case law is what we're really talking about. Case law, like we have in courts today, where it's not the law of what's written down, it's the law of what's been decided and accepted and then built upon. By the way, this is the feminine divine voice in the grammar. It's about, yeah, no, I'm just saying this, that if you have, Morgan Freeman's voice in your head for God here, that's not what you should be imagining. Yeah. There you go.
There you go.
Okay.
Eliezer's mother.
Yeah, exactly. Rabbi Eliezer's mom. Exactly. That's good.
Why were you?
So
This is all about my opinion's more important than yours.
exactly. So if you've read this story before and if you've studied with me enough, you've read this story because I love this. And it's maybe the most famous story in the Talmud. We study it for all sorts of the big ideas about Judaism, and we'll certainly talk about that in a moment. But just take it on its face value. Who are the early rabbis? They are a handful of people who can fit in one room, who are much closer to magicians and prophets in our imagination than they are to the rabbis of a Polish yeshiva, who can make trees dance and rivers go backwards for, and who God listens to, but also that they can call up God on their cell phones.
Yeah.
Right? That's who these people are. And that's why I say public magicians or prophets or what. That's this image we have. These are not a well-organized, politically important group. Okay. And here. So that's a quote from Deuteronomy that's being taken wildly out of context, by the way. The straightforward meaning in Deuteronomy is, in fact, that the Torah is straightforward. It's not in heaven. It's not across the ocean that you have to go there, right? You can just read it and understand it. It's actually an anti-mystic line in the book of Deuteronomy, right? Don't do this thing where you dig into every word and the Torah values and the numbers and the gematria and the Deuteronomy is saying, no, it's not in heaven. It's not some esoteric thing. But they're going to take it entirely differently.
Sounds like a Supreme Court.
Okay. So God intervenes and says, actually, Rabbi Eliezer's correct. And Rabbi Yoshua stands up, right? I object to God. God, you have no standing in this court. The Torah is not in heaven. God, what do you know about halakha? Right? That's what's being said here, which is wild. I mean, just wild. That God disagrees with the rabbis, and the rabbis say that's not important. Yeah, you don't know what you're talking about here. Again, it's a look at the way that they are thinking about rabbinic authority and the way that they're imagining it.
More important than the voice of God.
More important than the voice of God. And we'll get this great ending. Jump down to Rabbi Natan encountered Elijah. Yeah, please. No, I think we've got God showing up here and saying, actually, Rabbi Eliezer's right. And all the rabbis say, what do you know, God? Right? You have no standing in this court. This is not how it's supposed to work. You gave us the Torah, and then it was our job to continue it through the rabbinic process. Look at this ending here, and I think it'll actually help contextualize the whole thing. Rabbi Natan. Toby, will you finish it? So Elijah shows up in the Talmud to resolve disputes, so does a divine voice. These are the tropes that resolve disputes. Okay, so
God's throwing in the towel.
So yeah, exactly, right, Toby, and that's one of the great reads here. The other read that I will often use this for is just to show the progressive impulse within Judaism. Progressive meaning building upon rather than, I'm going to mute all, we're getting background noise. You can, of course, unmute yourself if you have something. But I think the other read here is about rabbinic authority and the creation of rabbinic authority. Because ultimately the takeaway from this text is that God God's opinion is that the rabbis are the authentic interpreters of Jewish tradition. Not even God. It's the rabbis who are the authentic interpreters of Jewish tradition. And if we place the whole project is chutzpah.
It works for the rabbi.
Yeah, it works for the rabbi. Yeah, I have no objection to it, Miriam. Actually, we've got no, but so Annette, I see your hand too in a second. But if we place this within the context that we understand of the early and even mid Talmudic rabbis who are struggling to gain acceptance as legitimate interpreters of the tradition, as legitimate leaders of the Jewish people in a political or religious sense, not that you can distinguish those, this has so much to say about that topic, right? And all of a sudden you're looking at your rabbi, you're living in the 7th century, you're looking at your rabbi who you're connected to in a world where rabbis have become relatively mainstream and rabbinic Judaism has become relatively mainstream. And you know that your rabbi doesn't seem to do miracles, but that's because your rabbi is not like the great rabbis of the past who were able to do these miracles back when they knew all of the magical spells and had a direct line to God and so on and so forth. The irony being, of course, that it's these later rabbis telling these stories who have way more power and influence and knowledge and legitimacy and authenticity and all these words than the rabbis that they're talking about way in the past. And so we can understand stories like this, and in some ways the Talmud as a whole, as a project of creating rabbinic legitimacy. And that means not just connecting the rabbis to the temple, but also seeing the rabbis as the inheritors of the Pharisees, right? If we're not going to understand it as a continuation of the Pharisees, but instead as sort of future remnants picking up the Pharisaical ideas, that's what we're getting throughout here. Okay, Annette. I think there's humor here that is supposed to be here that we miss, by the way. We treat these texts with such reverence. Right, it was like in last week's Torah portion where Moses asks to see God's backside.
Yeah.
It's a tushy joke. That's what the Torah has there, but we expect something different from these documents. So I think there is supposed to be humor here in that. There's certainly hubris also, but even more so what's happening is it is people living 500 years later imagining the importance of their ancestors. This is the same thing that King Josiah, right? Remember in 620, Josiah's court are the ones who write Deuteronomy and the books of Kings and Joshua and Judges and Samuel. The way that King Josiah's court imagines the glory of King David and King David's Jerusalem is what these later rabbis of the Talmud living in 550 are doing to the early rabbis who were living at 50. And that's what we're seeing here is that process.
How do you,
Leon, I keep muting you because I'm getting background echo, but if you've got something to say, go ahead and unmute yourself. But otherwise, you're muted. Elliot. Yeah, a divine voice emerges, a bat kol, like a voice from the heavens is the language here. No. This is a divine voice that just shows up. This is one of the tropes of the Talmud, is when the rabbis can't resolve something, it's either a divine voice or Elijah. And here we get both. There's also some language that we didn't go into at the beginning of this section that the rabbis tend to use in the Talmud when they are entering into a overtly mythological frame. They'll say something like, there is a tradition that has come down to us. And then you know you're about to get something spicy.
Tell me, what is it that
Did they believe this happened literally, the people who wrote this? That's a really interesting question.
Maybe they thought it didn't much matter whether it was.
I don't know the answer. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Again, the people who wrote this are not writing it from scratch. Clearly, there's an inherited tradition, and we're getting the final written version of it. Yeah, good question.
what
Miriam Raskin.
Yes. It's because it goes with their opinion.
So I think that's there too. Let me offer just one more perspective.
Yes. Or Trump calls
See,
it the Bible.
now you sound like Marx, Miriam. Good Jewish traditions there. Yeah. Let me give one more frame here, which is that I think many of us are willing to believe absurd things as long as we place them far away in the past. Some of us are not, but think about the number of deeply believing individuals of whatever religion who would never believe the religious stories that they have if they were set in the present,
Right.
but have no trouble accepting them as true in the far past. There does seem to be that seems to be a human thing as well. But yeah, no, I think you're very right about a lot of this, Miriam, too, and that I think a lot of these people understood it as political and literary and mythological. Yeah, Nancy. What I would say is zoom out enough that the labels of the different groups stop being important, and we can understand all of this as a part of the same sociological phenomenon and the same sociological reality. Yeah. It's also not an accident that, look at the sayings of Jesus that show up and how many of them come straight out of rabbinic literature or are mirrored in rabbinic literature, or even the sorts of miracles that he's doing, right? We just saw these here. Or even the way that the Christian scriptures work in parables. It's not that different from what we find. It's not different from this. It's not that different from all sorts of rabbinic literature pieces, because you back away from the labels like rabbis and Pharisees and Jesus followers and zealots. And instead what you're seeing is this group that are all living in the same stew. Jason. Yeah. I think that's really important to understand about the destruction is that it's the destruction of a civilization, but it's also a destruction of all of the accepted sources of authority. And so where authority comes from becomes much different, much more dispersed. Maybe we're living in a moment like that today a little bit, as we've seen the pillars of authority in our community come down. Okay. Yeah, Nancy.
So how do we get from that to the Chabad movement, the not Chabad, but the fringy kind of Orthodox movements, and Rabbi Schneerson being how?
You got to stick around. We're coming to that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, we'll get there. That's the story of us. That actually, I think, could people hear Nancy, what she said? How do we get from there to, Schneerson and those sorts of miracle workers? To me, that's actually the best part of Story of Us is when we get to our moment today and we can use the same lenses we've been using to talk about the past to understand ourselves. Right? What are the ways that we're all attempting to create and manipulate authority and power that we're not even realizing also?
One other quick question. What is it that the rabbis inherited from the Pharisees?
So what the rabbis inherit from the Pharisees seems to be a worldview, that they are the repositories of the oral traditions that have been passed on, and that the oral traditions are just as authentic and binding as the written traditions. But the Pharisees seem to be much more of a movement, much more unified, and the rabbis are the people picking up the pieces afterwards. The Pharisees often are very connected to the priestly caste. The rabbis, if anything, are a little dismissive of Kohens, of priests. So there's some real differences, even as they're picking up the mantle. I've been trying to come up all day with a good contemporary metaphor, and I can't quite get there. But doesn't historically work, but maybe in the way that the founders of America saw themselves as the inheritors of the Roman Republic. It's a little too distant. That doesn't quite work. I'll keep trying to come up with something. Okay. So first a shout out for Samantha, who put it in the chat, but Samantha's doing on Wednesdays at 7:00 Midot to Shavuos, a discussion group that counts the Omer together and studies together on the way to Shavuot, a traditional practice within Judaism. So be in touch with Samantha, who's on this chat, if you'd like. And then, hold on, let me turn